Hey everyone, welcome back to The Tent, your place for politics, policy, and progress. I'm Daniella Gibbs-Leger.
And I'm Colin Seaberger. Daniella, October is National Cookie Month.
Yay!
Can you believe it? Yeah.
I love cookies. I do like the fall, despite some I don't know, just misinformation that is floating out there that I don't like fall. I love fall.
I mean, what's not to love? Except for, we're starting off with a bang this fall in Washington, D.C. It's been raining nonstop for 2 weeks now. I mean, we've thankfully not suffered, obviously, like some other communities that we'll talk about on the episode this week, but it is nuts.
It is. We really could use this rain during our droughts during the summer, and
Yep.
I am looking forward to seeing the sun in a few days.
Well, with the holidays just around the corner, I am very much looking forward to more of your hot cookie takes in the weeks ahead. But I also heard that you had a really important conversation.
That's right. I spoke with our colleague, Andrew Miller, who is a senior fellow here at CAP Action and the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Israeli and Palestinian Affairs. And we talked about the 1 year anniversary of the October 7th attacks in Israel, the most recent updates on the wider conflict in the region, and how the U.S. should respond.
A really tough topic, to be sure, but one we also really need to talk about as we mark the 1 year anniversary of the massacre last year. But first, of course, we have to get to some news.
We do, Colin, because we had yet another debate this week.
We did.
And this time it was between the vice presidential candidates, Governor Tim Walz and Senator J.D. Vance. So let me just sum up a few things that Vance lied about on stage.
We're going to be here for a while, folks.
I know, I'll do the condensed version. He lied yet again by peddling conspiracies about the Haitian community in Springfield, Ohio. He lied about the economic record of the Trump administration. The economy was slowing even before the pandemic hit.
That's right.
Manufacturing was in a recession. And on Trump's way out the door, let's remember he had the worst jobs record of any modern president. Vance even tried to suggest, laughingly, that Donald Trump, quote, saved the Affordable Care Act.
Was that before or after the party that he threw in the Rose Garden when they tried to kick tens of thousands of people, or tens of millions,
Yes.
of Americans off of their health insurance?
Unclear, because Trump and the Republicans tried over 60 times to repeal the Affordable Care Act. And Trump has been campaigning on destroying the ACA for nearly a decade,
Yeah.
but insists he only has concepts of a plan to replace it. And we know what the plan is because he showed us when he was president.
Sure do.
Give insurance companies the power to charge people with pre-existing conditions more, gut Medicaid, and make premiums more expensive. Also, Vance said he never supported a nationwide abortion ban.
Come again?
Yeah, exactly. Even though he has, and he still does. And further, while he stressed the need for compassion on a debate stage, Vance has supported banning abortion even in cases of incest and rape, describing the latter as merely an inconvenience.
Outrageous.
It's totally outrageous. And I could go on, Colin. He said U.S. energy production was down when it's actually up. He dodged a question about whether a second Trump administration would separate families by deporting undocumented parents of U.S. citizens. And, who can forget how he characterized January 6th as part of a peaceful transfer of power and then refused to answer whether the election was stolen or not. Tim Walz was right. That was a damning non-answer.
You and Governor Walz are spot on, Daniela. If J.D. Vance can't be trusted to be honest about something as simple as our free and fair elections, how can we trust him on anything, right?
Exactly.
Look, Coach Walz may have sounded more like a normal guy than, the guy who went to Yale Law School, but he delivered real answers about the issues the American people actually care about. And he also exposed how Donald Trump's Project 2025 agenda would make things worse. And we have to consider that all of this happened on the same day Trump gave two rambling, incoherent, downright offensive campaign speeches in Wisconsin. He dismissed serious injuries sustained by U.S. troops on his watch during an Iranian attack in 2020, claiming those service members who, were just suffering from quote unquote headaches, right? He also confused Kim Jong Un with the leader of Iran. Where's the media's coverage of this, right? I feel like every day Donald Trump says something that's, trying to one up how many people he can offend or completely rewrite history. Where is the, media in actually exposing the truth of these things? It's no wonder Trump is afraid to make more media appearances. This week, he actually backed out of a 60 Minutes interview scheduled for the anniversary of October 7th, and he won't debate Vice President Harris again before the election. He claims it's because, it's too late in the election season, but he debated Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden in 2016 and 2020 at later points in October during those races. So, what's changed? Maybe it's that he can barely engage in a single speech or media appearance without saying something inaccurate, radical, dangerous, or outright offensive to the American people. So I'm sure Trump loved having JD Vance out there, lying through his teeth to spin his extreme agenda. But if he's too chicken to get on the debate stage again, I think the American people will rightfully see through that and wonder, what's the guy trying to hide?
Here, here, Colin. Now, unfortunately, we got to talk about Hurricane Helene and Trump's efforts to politicize a natural disaster. We heard a little bit about it during the debate. More on the former guy in just a moment. But as our listeners probably know, this hurricane was really a horrific storm.
Yeah.
According to the latest estimates, it's killed over 100 people, flooded homes across the southeast, and left more than 1 million people without power. And obviously, it's the kind of extreme weather we'll see more and more of as climate change continues to get worse. Scientists from the Department of Energy are already estimating climate change may have caused 50% more rainfall in some parts of Georgia and the Carolinas than what they would have experienced under normal conditions. That is an astounding figure when you consider that this past week brought 40 trillion with a T gallons of rain to the southeast. But I want to talk about the Biden administration's response to this catastrophic storm because it's really shown how incredible authority, organization, and cooperation, and it's being lauded by leaders across both the region and the political spectrum, which I think is important. On Friday, President Biden declared a national emergency, and then he declared major disasters in several states on Saturday. This allowed survivors to apply for FEMA relief funds immediately. The White House also quickly deployed more than 5,000 National Guardsmen to North Carolina, hit the hardest, and more than 3,500 federal employees from the U.S. Coast Guard, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, U.S. Health and Human Services, and other agencies throughout the entire region. On the day of this recording, President Biden is visiting the Carolinas, taking an aerial tour of affected areas, and then meeting with local first responders and officials. And the vice president is in Georgia doing the same thing.
Yeah, this administration is clearly got, all hands on deck and is working closely with state and local governments. As you mentioned, President Biden's already been in contact with governors, including Roy Cooper of North Carolina, Henry McMaster of South Carolina, Brian Kemp of Georgia, Glenn Youngkin of Virginia, and Ron DeSantis of Florida. He and the vice president have also spoken with the mayors of Asheville, Greenville, Savannah, and other cities that have been impacted by the storm. Governor McMaster has said that the administration's response has been quote unquote superb. And Governor Kemp has said that he's gotten everything that Georgia needs from the federal government. You won't often find MAGA Republican leaders like McMaster, Kemp, Youngkin, or DeSantis thanking and even cooperating with the Biden administration and its agencies. But all four of them have praised the recovery efforts and indicated they've gotten exactly the resources and the support that they're looking for, which is why it's also so disheartening to see Donald Trump out there politicizing the situation by spreading dangerous lies rather than actually rolling up his sleeves and, doing the hard work of trying to help people put their lives back together. Be part of the solution, Donald. The Biden administration is doing its job quickly and effectively. To say that it isn't is, especially to the people on the ground in these states is, really outrageous, and it's so, all about sowing confusion and, putting people in more danger, right? That's not to mention the fact that Trump discussed many of these lies in a campaign speech in Georgia this week. He didn't seem at all concerned that speaking there would take away law enforcement resources from recovery efforts. He was too excited trying to, book a speaking gig at a local business because he saw how badly damaged the building was and wanted to use it for a campaign backdrop, right? It's despicable, but it's not totally surprising coming from a guy who aligns himself with the Project 2025 agenda, which would eliminate the Small Business Administration's disaster loan program. It's the federal government's largest source of disaster recovery funds for survivors of these storms. So it's not surprising, but I think it really just reveals his out of touch motivations.
Yeah, and his true character,
Yeah,
right? And it just goes to show that Americans need real leadership from people who can remain focused and dedicated in times of crisis,
that's right.
not people who use natural disasters, deaths, and suffering as political opportunities. Trump has a long track record of mishandling extreme weather and natural disasters, like when he threw paper towels at the people of Puerto Rico reeling from a hurricane, withheld billions of assistance from states and territories run by officials he disagreed with politically,
Yeah.
like Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Puerto Rico, and personally altered hurricane maps with Sharpie pens. Like, what?
I know. It's so wild. I can't even get those images outside of my head. It's like, who responds to this kind of trauma
Right.
with this kind of buffoonery, right? I mean, it's totally, totally nuts. Well, on that note, if there's anything else you'd like us to cover on the pod, hit us up on Twitter, Threads, or Instagram at the Tent Pod. That's at the Tent Pod.
And stick around for my interview with Andrew Miller in just a beat. Andrew Miller is a senior fellow for national security and international policy at the Center for American Progress Action Fund. He previously served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Israeli and Palestinian Affairs at the State Department. Before that, he served as a senior policy advisor to the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas Greenfield. Earlier in his career, he served in a number of roles in the State Department and on President Barack Obama's National Security Council. Andrew Miller, thank you so much for joining us on The Tent.
Thank you for having me.
So we are 1 year out from the October 7th attacks by Hamas. You were the most senior State Department official working on issues related to Gaza before leaving the State Department earlier this year. Obviously you won't be able to tell us about everything in your experience leading the State Department's response, but can you talk about the events of that day and the impact they've had 1 year later?
It's it's still a very, very raw emotion that's left with you, not only from the events of October 7th itself, but everything that we now know has followed it. And on the day there was true shock, not shock that Hamas would try to do something like that, but more shock that they would succeed and succeed so spectacularly, which owes in part to failures on Israel's part, not only intelligence, but some tactical and military blunders that might have led to a different outcome on that day. But it truly was horrific. And it's one of those few moments in my career where you're always dealing with issues that have an impact on people, and sometimes millions or even billions of people. But this was one where it took your breath away because the enormity of the tragedy, the magnitude of the suffering was so extreme. And certainly attacking homes, women and children, and footage was circulating immediately. It was very, very, very hard to take. We were not obviously anticipating what happened in Gaza. We did think there was a distinct possibility for some type of outbreak in Israel and the Palestinian territories. We thought it was more likely in the West Bank, given tensions and violence between extremist settlers and Palestinian militant groups, and just the march of the settlement enterprise and occupation. but we did not obviously have our eyes on Gaza. And I still remember a few days before October 7th, was in Israel, and I was meeting with a senior Israeli defense official who was responsible for intelligence. And he was talking about how domesticated Hamas had become, and that they had put them in the place and they were in a good place. So that really stuck with me, I thought that person must feel particularly awful because his shop was predicting that things were going to be calm. But looking out a year from now, the suffering is truly extraordinary, and it's truly ecumenical, cross-sectional. Everyone has suffered. All civilians have suffered. All of the peoples of the region have suffered, whether it's Israelis, Israeli Jews, Israeli Arabs, Israeli Druze, whether certainly the Palestinians, the Lebanese. It is been first and foremost a catastrophe for them. And that's something that I think is particularly important to keep in mind, because we understandably are so focused on the maneuvers and calculations of the leadership, which is determinant of what happens, but it's the people ultimately who end up paying the price. And looking at it now, and I think this would be true even if circumstances were much better than they were today, I would have regret, because there's always more you can do. And this was a situation where you knew no good was going to come out of it, particularly in the short term. I mean, and to be clear, nothing justifies it, but unintended consequences can be good and they can be bad. And sometimes there are good unintended consequences of very bad things, which this certainly was. And it was just obvious that if there were to be any green shoots that came, it would take several years for those to materialize. And we were in a position where we were just trying to minimize suffering, minimizing harm. And I'm proud of the effort that was made. But if you aren't thinking about what you could have done better, you're probably not doing your job as well as you can.
I want to talk about what's happening right now, and things are escalating pretty quickly this week with Israel launching incursions into Lebanon and Iran launching ballistic missiles at Israel. We are taping this interview on a Wednesday afternoon, and things may change by the time this airs tomorrow morning. But how concerned are you that this conflict continue to escalate? And what is the significance of Iran directly attacking Israel after operating via proxies in the region for so long? And what do you make of the fact that Iran's counterstrike appears to have been a failure?
So Iran's decision to launch an attack itself, and this is the second time in 6 months that they've done so, the first one being back in April, which they did in conjunction with some of their proxies, I think is very much a reflection of the degradation of their proxies. Not only Hamas, but Hezbollah, and to a lesser extent, some of the smaller militant organizations that operate in Lebanon, that operate in Gaza, the West Bank, other parts of the region. And the assumption was those groups were much stronger, were much more capable of inflicting harm than, not necessarily than they were, but that Israel was not in a position to neutralize them so quickly. So that's one of the assumptions that I think we got wrong about throughout this period, and there are a number of assumptions that have proved wrong in various directions. And those are particularly dangerous moments because it's good to recognize when an assumption is wrong. That doesn't mean your new assumption is the right one. It could be even more wrong than the old assumption. And that's why this period is so volatile. Anytime there's a war and anytime there's a risk of it spreading, there is a lot that is left to chance. And the fog of war, as they say, is always present. Things can just happen you don't anticipate. But it's somehow worse in this case because, even when you have the right assumptions or reasonable assumptions, there's a part that you can't control. we can't even, control the part that we assumed we understood. So we're rapidly adjusting, and more often than not, you make errors when you're improvising on the ground. Um, it is a significant escalation. It's I believe about 180 ballistic missiles were launched, and that's 50% more than were launched in the April attack. The April attack also included drones and cruise missiles, which are easier to intercept because they're slow. It takes hours to reach Israel, whereas ballistic missiles, 15 minutes. And you have to intercept them often in the exo-atmosphere. It's remarkable that it can be done. So this attack was more severe, it was more provocative, and it was intended to cause more harm. I'm still astounded by how well Israeli missile defense systems have performed against those weapons in particular. I wasn't surprised how well they did against cruise missiles, against drones, against rockets. There's a demonstrated track record. This is the first time that the Arrow system, which is a co-developed missile defense system between the U.S. and Israel, has been used in combat. This is the second time after April.
So this is different from Iron Dome.
Yes.
Okay.
So Israel has a multi-layered missile defense. It's not just a single system, and you can intercept at different points, both horizontally geographically and vertically at different points of the atmosphere. And that's part of what makes it so successful. If you miss, you get another chance. It's not just one shot like with Patriot missiles, and if you don't hit it, then bad things are going to happen. But I don't think anyone going into April expected the success rate that they recorded. And again, it appears to have been successful. However, the more I look into the details of this attack, it does appear that it certainly wasn't a success. It was a failure. It was a defeat. And that raises the question of whether Iran will feel compelled to do more, regardless of whether and how Israel does respond to the attack. But it does appear that more of the ballistic missiles made it through this time. And they even were able to hit several Israeli air bases. Now, they did no damage that actually prevented the operation of the airfield, but that means that they were more accurate than last time, and that means Iran made some adjustment in order to evade the missile defenses. So looking forward, there is a risk that the Arrow system is not going to be able to replicate the same success. So the confidence that Israel has at this time, the confidence the U.S. has in those systems is understandable, but we have to recognize very small sample size, and over time, this could change in dramatic ways, and that has direct consequences for the policies that we should be advocating for Israel. If you assume that Israel can essentially defend itself with our help from anything or anyone, then you have more latitude to engage in offensive actions against terrorist and militant groups. If you think that risk of being hit is going to grow, you're going to be more conservative. And I think at the very least, the administration needs to consider the possibility that they're not going to be able to maintain this level of efficacy for the next several months, and certainly not in years to come.
Well, let's talk about the Israeli government and what you think their possible response will be to this, and will it be an escalation again?
It does appear that they are planning to escalate. All of the rhetoric that we've seen out of the cabinet, out of the Israeli cabinet, from other Israeli politicians, all of the unattributed U.S. government sources who have been speaking about it are speaking in terms of escalation. And because Israel feels like it can handle however Iran responds, they believe they have more latitude in ratcheting up the response. I think what will be important is whether Israel takes an action that could be perceived as aimed at toppling the Iranian regime. Now, of course, I'm not vouching for the Iranian regime. It's despicable, and
Right.
Its collapse would be for the betterment of all Iranians and all people in the region. But should should Israel, for instance, target the nuclear facilities, or if they target the energy sector, which is the lifeblood of the Iranian economy at this point, coupled with the fact that Prime Minister Netanyahu gave an interview in English, subtitled in Farsi, basically saying your liberation is coming, that you're going to be free sooner rather than later to the Iranian people.
Wow, really?
Yes, and other Israeli political officials have said we should seek to overthrow the regime. There is a real risk that they could cross that territory, and the response could be perceived as at least the start of an effort to oust the regime. And whatever caution or restraint Iran has used so far, because they know that Israel has an escalatory advantage, could disappear if their backs are against the wall. If they think the only alternative is the fall of the regime and their physical elimination, they're going to behave differently and probably take more risks than they have up until this point. So it'll be very important for the administration, to the extent possible, to try to direct Israel to other types of targets. I think if they go after air defense systems again, that's relatively safe, and it's useful because degrading air defense, if necessary, it'll be easier to conduct further strikes, or even targeting certain Iranian military leaders who aren't necessarily the most important, but nevertheless are important enough that they would get attention. That's less likely to escalate, but that still could as well. So that is the inherent danger of this situation, that you have to have humility, and you have to understand that no matter how confident you are, there is a non-zero probability you're wrong.
You mentioned Prime Minister Netanyahu, so I want to talk a little bit about his response to this conflict. His handling of this war and the loss of innocent Palestinian life under his watch has been pretty horrifying in my view, and it has been condemned by our government, our allies around the world, and many of his own people who have been taking to the streets to protest throughout the past year. So what do you think his motivations are for ratcheting up this conflict in the Middle East? Why hasn't he accepted any of the recent, rounds of ceasefire deals?
I think his response, to use a term from political science, is overdetermined, in that all of the variables are pushing the same direction. There certainly is. It's more likely than not that there are political considerations, and they're not just political considerations for him. They are questions of his personal freedom, whether he's going to be, whether he will continue to be prosecuted on corruption. He could be sent to prison. He could be sent to prison for the rest of his life. As long as he remains in power, he can make an argument that those proceedings should not continue because he is the duly anointed prime minister of Israel. And it's hard to believe that doesn't play some role at all. At the very least, a subconscious that he knows there is a risk, a huge personal risk if the government falls. Maybe at a much more conscious level, I don't know, and I won't claim to read his thoughts, but it would be incredulous to claim that it's not a consideration. The other thing about Netanyahu that's important to consider is, I think people get him wrong. And what I mean by that is, for the past 16 years since he returned to power after his first short term as prime minister, every administration, Democrat and Republican, has assumed that he's a political animal. He's very good at what he does. But if we maneuver and if we create the right political incentives and conditions, he'll ultimately do what we need him to do. And I think that's mistaken because it assumes you can outplay him, which is very difficult to do. But two, he is not devoid of his own beliefs. His father was an ideologue, Benzion Netanyahu, who came out of the revisionist Zionist camp, who were the most belligerent, who were talking about greater Israel, i.e., not just Gaza and the West Bank, but Jordan being part of Israel. And while his style, his tactics, his language are very different from some on the extreme right, his ultimate views about the goals for Israel aren't as different from them as you would hope. And I think that's also he truly believes that these people, and I think he would probably use that term. I remember back in 2015 when he gave when he posted on Facebook, the Arabs are turning out in droves, and we were all horrified by that, what only can be described as racist remark. But I think his attitude is these people, the Arabs, only understand force, and therefore we not only need to show that we're willing to match them, we need to show that we're willing to dominate, that we can escalate above them. And ultimately, he has always been of the view that military force is the primary currency, and with military force, at least enough of it, you can do almost anything. It's not a coincidence he was one of the biggest advocates for the invasion of Iraq. And as the Iraq War, as potentially with Gaza, with Lebanon, technically Iraq was a military success in that we achieved, our initial goal of ousting the regime, of disbanding the Iraqi military. It was a political and strategic failure, and the reality, and I think the single most important lesson about the Middle East, but I think it also applies globally, is that the relationship between military and strategic success is not highly correlated. Military success may be a necessary condition for political strategic success, but it's by no means sufficient. And there is a great danger in overusing military force in ways that make it more difficult to achieve the political outcomes you're seeking. One example of it is there's a piece in the New York Times today that they were evaluating Arab commentary on Hassan Nasrallah, and people have a more favorable attitude about him now that he's been assassinated than before. And something similar happened in 2006, where Hezbollah was detested by most Arabs, was detested by most Lebanese. And then when the Israelis responded to a Hezbollah provocation and began conducting attacks, it's not that they stopped hating Hezbollah, it's that they hated Israel more because Israel was causing destruction. And that's a lesson Netanyahu hasn't learned, and I'm afraid that's a lesson that not enough senior officials, and when I say senior officials, not just this administration, I think the entire foreign policy community has not learned to the extent we should.
So, we are commemorating what happened on October 7th. So I want to end by remembering the Israeli and Palestinian lives that have been lost and what this day means to so many people personally. How can our listeners here in the U.S. Support those continue to experience grief, loss, or hardship from this conflict? And how can we fight back against both growing anti-Semitism and Islamophobia manifesting itself here at home as a result of these events?
I think we need to start with what is a simple premise and should not be controversial, but somehow is controversial these days. And I actually learned this from my grandmother, who was born in 1914, and you wouldn't expect someone who was born, I think, before World War I started to be of this view. But she always used to tell me, Andy, people are the same everywhere. It doesn't matter what religion they practice. It doesn't matter what color their skin. It doesn't matter what gender they are. It doesn't matter who they identify with. We are made of the same, literally, material. We have the same hopes, ambitions. We have the same fears. We have the same instinctual reactions to things. And that remains true. Like, yes, their expressions, manifestations are different from culture to culture, but ultimately there's much more uniting us than dividing us. And that has clearly been a casualty of this war, along with the actual physical casualties of Palestinians, Israelis, Lebanese who have been killed. And it's a macabre business when we're getting into evaluating the validity of whether it's 42,000 or 32,000. That whether it's one person, that is a tragedy when civilians are killed. And I think what's most important is that those forms of hatred, any forms of hatred, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, anti-Arab sentiment, anti-Black racism, homophobia, transphobia, they need to be challenged whenever they surface. You cannot concede a fight, because if you concede a fight, that means minds may be drawn to that. So whether it's the most minor microaggression to a presidential candidate who's espousing avowedly racist or avowedly anti-Semitic, as former President Trump has language, that needs to be called out immediately. And it needs to be called out not just by those who are affected, but by those who are part of the in-group that person is supposed to represent. That's true of officials, of elected officials, of government officials. It's true of faith communities. It's true of grassroots organizations. And it's also true of the media. The media has a responsibility to call a spade. And when they see this type of conduct, it has to be called out. I was glad to see Margaret Brennan fact check J.D. Vance yesterday over the status of the Haitian immigrants in Ohio yesterday, notwithstanding whatever rules were agreed. But that type of bigotry cannot be allowed to stand. And it can have a positive dynamic. It's about reaching, I think, a critical mass. And enough of those small actions combined with big actions could eventually create a tidal wave that moves things. And I was actually speaking about this earlier today, but I was reminded of President Obama saying the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And I think that's what we have to take into our hearts and understand, that this is a long road. We're going to have setbacks, but we need to fight this every step of the way. And if we do, we're going to make progress. Perfection is perhaps unattainable, but things can always get better. And the best way, perhaps, to honor those who have been killed, injured, or otherwise affected on the October 7th attacks as a result of subsequent hostilities is to take on the task of challenging the processes of dehumanization that have become so embedded in our societies. And I say this with obvious humility. It's not just Israeli society or Palestinian society or Iranian society. It's in the United States. It's in the United Kingdom, France. It's Russia. Everywhere that you see these patterns taking place. So that is, it's strategically important, but even more than that, it's a moral imperative. And I hope that on October 7th, there is a recognition that whatever sympathies a person has, that we can start from a place of agreement regarding the sanctity of life of everyone, not necessarily in a religious sense. It can be in a religious sense, but just that all individual lives are precious, and we should be very, very cautious and very, very hesitant to deign to determine the fate of other human beings.
Well, I think that is a great way to end this interview. And your grandmother sounds like she was very, very wise.
I would be lost. I would have been lost had it not been for her influence.
Well, I'm thankful for her, and I want to thank you for joining us on the tent today.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's going to do it for us this week, folks. As always, please go back and check out previous episodes. Before we go, Colin, thought it'd be a good time to talk about how we are de-stressing in these coming weeks before the election. What are we doing for self-care?
Taking some slow, deep breaths. But besides that, we're going to Disney on Ice in my family. Not this weekend, but next weekend.
Okay.
My daughter's going to be so excited.
What's her favorite Disney show or character?
It really vacillates between The Little Mermaid. She loves The Little Mermaid.
She's great taste.
Loves Moana. But, I mean, she's a loyal Elsa and Anna.
Okay.
Stan.
Thank you
Yeah.
for putting Anna in there.
I mean,
because I believe we've talked about this on the show before.
That may have been my own editorializing.
Okay.
She...
Because you're with me on Elsa, right?
Yes.
Thank
Elsa's beep. No.
Yep. I'm so glad we're on the same page there. Okay.
Yep. Full stop.
Full stop. All
what
right.
about you?
I watch garbage television, right? So, okay, no, it's not garbage television. It is reality television
Yes.
that allows me to shut off my brain and focus on the plights of other people that are sometimes hilarious.
We all need a comedic escape from time to time.
Exactly. I also may be one of the few people who still watch The Challenge on MTV.
Nope.
Okay, well, I love it. They are celebrating their 40th season.
Wow.
I think that's right.
That's incredible.
Yeah,
I didn't know MTV was still around.
Well, in fairness to you, they don't play music videos anymore. So is it
Fair.
really MTV or is it just like TV?
Yeah.
Anyway. But yeah, it's reality TV.
Well, I have got to catch up because not only am I trying to keep up with the Real Housewives of Salt Lake City, the Real Housewives of Orange County, but New York also launched this week.
I know.
So I gotta plug in, and it's hard to do when I'm also trying to keep tabs on college and NFL football going on right now.
Yeah, I know. All right, Colin, just get it out of the way. Cowboys beat the Giants.
I did.
Barely.
I can't, I feel like trumpet my horn too much after the performance last week. Yes, we got the W, but I can't say it was a beautiful game on anybody's part.
It certainly was not. There were definitely some great moments that happened for the Giants, but it was a deeper reminder of how bad our quarterback is.
Can't disagree with you there.
Yeah,
Cannot disagree.
Nope.
But speaking of better football, last Saturday, my husband and I were watching the Alabama-Georgia match, and that was incredible. Like the first half, Alabama came out of the gate so hard. I think it was like 28-3.
It was embarrassing.
27 at the end of the first half, and so we flipped over to watch Industry and came back after the episode, and it was like fourth quarter, 6-7 minutes left to go, and it was like a one-possession game. I was like, oh my God, this is crazy, but that is so college football.
That's why we love it.
Right? Yeah. So Alabama ended up pulling out the W, which I'm a little salty on because they ended up replacing UT as the #1 football team
Sorry about that.
in the college rankings. But we've got some big games coming up over the course of the next few weeks, taking on OU in the Red River rivalry. Say that 4 times fast.
I shan't.
And we're going to be playing Georgia.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
That's going to be a big game.
a big few games back to back.
Well, at least you have college football to, keep you happy. You'll notice that I'm not really talking about Virginia football.
Well, we invite, folks to join the club. Longhorns are a friendly bunch.
No, Colin. That's not going to happen. On that note, y'all take care of yourselves. Get your flu shots. Get
That's
your COVID
right.
boosters.
Yep.
And we will talk to you next week. The Tent is a podcast from the Center for American Progress Action Fund. It's hosted by me, Daniella Gibbs-Leger, and co-hosted by Colin Seeberger. Aaron Phillips is our lead producer. Kelly McCoy is our supervising producer. Mishka Espy is our booking producer. Muggs Leone is our digital producer. Hi Fan, Matthew Gossage, Olivia Mowry, and Tony Pandolfo are our video team. Views expressed by guests of The Tent are their own, and interviews are not endorsements of a guest's perspectives. You can find us on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts.